Hi, Phyllis. Long time no talk to.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So basically, I just want to reiterate the most top of mind subject that we've all been focused on here for the past several weeks, and that is commission conversations and kind of how things are going to change. I am working, and I'm hoping to have something.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Phyllis. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of what our forms and how they're going to be changing. I'm aware of some of the changes, can't really discuss them in any specific detail, but I can absolutely tell you that this form that we're looking at on the screen, the buyer brokerage agreement, is going to change for the better. And it's going to change to accommodate the new changes in what's going to happen in our industry. One of the most significant changes is the commission paragraph. And in the commission paragraph, we're going to have to deal with the requirement now that not only is a buyer committing to the amount of commission that they themselves are willing to pay should it come out of their pocket, but they also have to consent to the maximum amount that we can receive should the money be paid by someone else, which would be the seller. Okay. That's a new element that we have not had to deal with before. I have a highlighted version of our current buyer brokerage agreement on the screen. And I just want to point out to you guys, it still is going to say that, the buyer is agreeing to pay the commission in the buyer brokerage agreement. We have to be more diligent than ever. We're also going to have our customer agreement because, money and agency are two different things. And we have to establish before we go out and do the work, we're going to have to establish how we get paid for that work. That's now more than ever going to become a huge deal. So people are either customers or clients. Our customer agreement is going to include commission payment language, just like the buyer brokerage. So your choices are going to be exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, which is what we're looking at here, non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, and then a customer agreement if someone wants to be a customer, not a client. And again, you can also make these agreements short term. You can make them just for a weekend. You could make them non-exclusive. You can make them specific to certain houses that you're showing and put that in the agreement. But before you go out there and start doing the work, showing houses, which is a duty that is unique to people that are licensed salespeople, which is what you guys are and what you do for a living, you're going to need to establish how you're going to get paid should you actually accomplish the goal that's of finding the house, of procuring a house for them and getting them under contract and getting it to closing. So that's something that we're just going to have to be stronger about, having those conversations with the buyers. I highlighted in green here that we need to make sure the buyers understand that there is absolutely no legal obligation anyway, anyhow, at any time that a seller is obligated to pay the buyer brokerage commission. But that if the seller is willing to pay, either through negotiations or they've already incorporated enough commission in their listing agreement commission that they've agreed to with their listing broker, that and agreed that can be paid out to a buyer broker if a buyer broker procures a buyer for them, then that amount that they pay will offset the amount that the buyers agreed to. So basically, if for example, the buyer agency agreement says that there is a percentage of 3% of the purchase price, then the seller is agreeing to pay a commission that is also 3% of the purchase price. Then if the seller pays that at closing, that will completely wipe away what the buyer has agreed. Now, right now, if the buyer brokerage agreement had, say, for example, 3% of the purchase price in it, and the seller was offering, for example, 2% purchase price, now and in the future, that gap where the amount that the buyer has agreed to pay exceeds the amount the seller's paying, that gap is an out-of-pocket expense and is the responsibility of the buyer. Now, there's always special steps, and we're going to look at those in a minute, where you could ask the seller to pay the full amount that's equal to what's in the buyer brokerage agreement, and that would be great. Here's what's really going to change. A couple things, but one thing that's really going to change, and you're going to see this, it's going to have to be addressed in the revisions to this buyer brokerage agreement, which I expect will probably come out and be usable by hopefully July. That's the time frame we're expecting to hopefully have that be able to, those revisions to actually hit. Could happen a little bit before then, but the current way that this document reads, if the amount that the seller is paying, let's say you had 2% in the buyer's broker, that's what the buyer's committing to pay out of their pocket. Then the seller is offering 3%, or maybe 3% plus a $2,000 bonus, whatever it is. It's exceeding the amount that the buyer has agreed to pay. So right now, that's no problem, as long as it's not a lesser amount where the buyer would actually have to make up that difference. The fact that you could earn more from the seller is no problem. In the future, moving forward, once the settlement terms go into effect, which could be as early as July and as late as the end of the year, but when that actually happens, what's going to happen is the buyers will then have to consent to the fact that when someone else is paying your commission, in the name of transparency, they have to know how much you're going to get paid. Not just at the closing table when they see it on the settlement statement. They're going to have to know and upfront consent to you being allowed to earn X number of dollars or X number of percent of the purchase price. So what I'm going to tell you guys is, when it comes to filling in that section, it's not in this buyer brokerage agreement yet, but I promise you something is going to be in there to deal with this, because this is a required part of the settlement. So when that happens, I'm going to advise that you round up to a higher amount so that it's kind of a not to exceed, and just train your clients, your buyer clients, that that's the way it's going to happen. I see some questions popping up in the chat. Why don't you guys just go ahead and unmute and tell me what it is you guys are wanting to. Somebody asked me, would we need to amend the buyer brokerage agreement? Yes, you always need to amend it if it's not going to be, you always need to amend it if it's not going to be something that is matching. But if this form gets revised and you confront it from the beginning and you put in a higher than expected amount, then that the incident of you having to amend it should be, a non-existent thing, if we can get this embedded in this form. And that's what I expect will happen.
Angie, Mika asked the question in the chat about if the BBA has a lower percentage than what the seller is offering, what would happen? And I answered her question. I told her that you would address this. I'm sure you will, but you would need to amend your buyer brokerage agreement, because otherwise you're going to get stuck with the lower percentage. And I don't
Correct.
think your buyer will care about that. So I don't see why they wouldn't sign an amendment. But you would need to amend your contract, or otherwise you're only going to get paid what your brokerage agreement says.
Correct. But the good thing, Mika, is this form, before those changes go into effect, this form will change and you'll have two commission sections in it. One's going to have basically what you see now, which is what the buyer's paying if it comes out of their pocket. That's one amount. Then they're going to have another section that's the consent. It's not the buyer saying, I'm going to pay it. It's the buyer saying, somebody else is going to pay it, but I'm okay with Mika getting $1 million. If she can get $1 million, good for her. So it's all about transparency, transparency, transparency. So before that actually goes into play, this form will be out and available with revisions to accommodate that section. So you have buyer pays, buyer agrees, and only if seller is paying less or nothing would that affect the buyer's wallet. If seller's paying the same or more, then that doesn't affect buyer's wallet. But if the seller's paying more, then guess what? We go down here to this blank where you've consented that the seller could pay me more because it's not coming out of your pocket. Is that cool? Does everybody understand? Okay. So let's look at a couple things. Right now, we have, and I'm just saying, this is what we have right now. We could end up having, these will probably still exist, these special steps, but there could be other changes coming down the line that I'm not at liberty to discuss. But either way, this is going to, you're going to start seeing on a large scale commissions put into contracts. So I know many of you have heard that the MLS not being able to advertise co-op commissions in the MLS. So even if a seller is agreeing to pay a co-op commission, we're not going to have the convenience of being able to see that in the MLS advertised. So that means you're going to have to reach out and contact the listing agents. Now, those of you who do listings, I want you guys to keep your listing websites up to date. I've even suggested that agents put in autoresponder emails that have all their latest listings that are available and also the co-op commissions and everything in their autoresponder. Just update that on a daily basis because that's a quick fix that could save you a lot of misery as an agent. Update your voicemail even on a daily basis and say, all of my listings are currently active. This is currently this is currently that. I know that seems silly, but that 2 or 3 minutes a day could save you hours of return phone calls and emails. So keeping your own advertising up, putting flyers in the house, putting riders on the sign, putting QR codes on your sign that direct people to find out information about the house. Things like that. These are the things we can do to help make life easier and still communicate what we want to communicate. But there's certainly going to be times where maybe you're the one representing the buyer and you don't know for certain if the seller is offering a co-op commission. It's going to affect your buyer's bottom line. It's going to be like any other term to the contract, whether the buyer asks for closing cost or whether they ask for a price or whether they ask for a certain closing date or this or that. It's any other term in the contract. It's not going to be an always thing. There may be a case where there's 10 other offers out there, and because there's 10 other offers out there, the buyer may say, I will pay this commission out of my pocket. They need to understand that in that case, if they're going to pay the commission out of their pocket, that all that information has to go to the lender and the closing attorney. The lender will have to make sure they have a source of funds to pay that out of their pocket. They're going to be sourcing that money. And so, they need to understand that. But if they're trying to put together a competitive offer, you're going to have buyers that are going to say, hey, if the seller's not offering to pay this, then I will choose to pay this out of my pocket. I have the cash and I'll do it. So again, let's not just think of it like this is always going to be one thing in the same scenario every time. So right now, if you have a buyer that is like, I don't want to pay it out of my pocket, or in the case of a VA buyer, I can't pay it because my loan type and the regulations around VA loans won't allow me, then in order to request the seller to pay the commission that will basically cover buyer's broker's fee and do this on buyer's behalf, we have Special Step 619 and Special Step 620. Special Step 619 is specific to VA loan buyers. And it says, since under the VA loan purchase program, buyer cannot pay buyer's broker commission, buyer hereby requests and seller hereby agrees to pay buyer's broker. Now, this just says blank. I will caution you, and I've asked the Forms Committee to actually embellish this language and say blank % of purchase price or blank dollars, because it just says blank. And my concern is the agents are going to, out of habit, they're going to write in 3%. Problem is, it doesn't say 3% of what. So that's going to end up biting people. So you've got to actually put 3% of purchase price right now, if that's what you want to put, or 2% of purchase price. What I want to tell you is don't put the difference. Put the total amount. For example, if the seller's offering a 2% co-op and the buyer has agreed to pay a 3% commission in the buyer brokerage, you're not going to ask for them to pay 1% because you've just given yourself a 50% pay reduction and you've actually screwed the buyer. Now they owe more. You're going to bring the seller up to the 3%. Okay. You're bringing the seller up to the 3%. So you put the total amount that the seller will pay at closing. So if you want them to pay more, you put the total amount, and don't forget to write the words of purchase price, 3% of purchase price. And of course, you could always do a flat fee as well. But these days, I would say the vast majority of time, we see it reflected as a percentage of the purchase price. Now, this language also has very important disclaimer language in it. It says that the buyer is asking the seller to pay a total real estate commission to buyer's broker at closing. And then it has a disclaimer. It says, nothing herein shall be interpreted as a request to alter, modify, or change the commission to be received by seller's broker, aka listing broker, if any, that seller may have agreed to pay seller's broker in a separate written agreement, like the seller's brokerage agreement, also known as a listing agreement. So that's going to be a unique special step for buyers that are VA loan buyers. Now let's look at special step 620. Special step 620 reads almost identically, but it's more of a universal ask and not specific to VA buyers. And this says, buyer hereby requests and seller hereby agrees to pay buyer's broker blank %, and we're going to say of purchase price, as total real estate commission due to buyer's broker at closing. Nothing herein shall be interpreted as a request to alter, modify, or change commission to be received by seller's broker, if any, that seller may have agreed to pay seller's broker in any separate written agreement. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention this because I have a lot of agents that are confused and they'll try to look up these special steps and they are looking up the form numbers. These aren't form numbers. They're not forms at all. You have to go into the GAR forms and you want to do a search of 2024 special stipulations. When you do that search, two things pop up: the 2024 special stipulations and the 2024 special stipulations index. You don't need the index. You just pull up the collection of special steps and then you scroll down and you will see these. They're in numerical order and you'll see special step 6.9 and 6.20. They're a collection of hundreds of special steps written by the GAR Forms Committee and the attorneys for GAR that are meant to be compatible with our GAR forms. Any questions about these two before we move on? Okay, there's another tool in your toolbox. And again, all these things are things that you and your buyer, your team, and you're going to strategize how you want your offer to look. And buyers may or may not wish to ask for these types of concessions. It just depends on how competitive the situation is. Or if you have reason to believe, for example, that the seller is offering to pay a co-op commission, but you don't have any kind of set agreement nailing them down on that, then you could always use these just as an abundance of caution. But another tool that could be used is your closing cost. This is the closing cost paragraph on the screen. It says paragraph 3. That's actually coming from the GAR purchase and sale. So a couple of years ago, the Forms Committee added language to the GAR purchase and sale agreement that said that that the seller's contribution, if there are any, that has been negotiated and asked for the seller to pay closing costs on the buyer's behalf, that if the buyer directs their lender to allot some or all of those closing costs that the seller's contributing towards the buyer's brokerage commission obligation in their buyer brokerage agreement, that this is an allowable use of those closing costs. The thing that you've got to remember here is that closing costs have a not to exceed cap, And so if closing costs are used to pay commission, that's perfectly fine, but it's going to have a not to exceed cap based on the loan type. So for your conventional loans, the seller's contribution to closing costs is usually going to cap out at 3%. For FHA, it's usually going to cap out at 6%. No problem. But understand that if the buyer's allotting that, let's just say it is 3% closing cost that has been negotiated with the seller to pay for the buyer brokerage commission, then they're going to have to come up out of pocket with their closing costs. So if the seller is willing to pay a commission and pay closing costs, it's better to use special stip 620 or special stip 619 that we just went to, rather than using the closing cost if the buyer actually needs closing costs paid by the seller, because when special stip 619 or 620 are used, the commission is not going to go against that seller maximum credit from a lender perspective. It's going to show up on the settlement statement just as seller's fee for paying commission. It's not going to go against the maximum allotment that they're allowed to pay for closing costs. Again, this is all going to depend on your particular buyer, the particular property, how hot a property it is, what the seller's willing to pay, what they're not willing to pay, etc. This is just, again, another layer. But let's say seller was not wanting to see the words commission, adamant that they were not paying a quote commission, but they're willing to negotiate closing costs with your buyer, and your buyer, says, I can, pay my own commission, or I could pay my own closing costs, or whatever. You only have so much money to play with in that scenario, but under the closing cost paragraph, with it allowing closing costs to be used by the buyer to cover their commission obligations, that's great. But the one thing that's missing is anything to pin the buyer down on that decision. If you just leave the language in paragraph 3 that stands there by itself, it says this is one of the many things that the buyer could use to that closing cost contribution for. One of the many things is commission, but it doesn't actually pin them down on how much of it and whether that's actually how they're going to direct their lender to use it. So at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, I created a special stip. I'm going to ask the GAR committee to also create their version of it, but this is basically just making the buyer accountable in the case where buyer is saying, oh, I'm going to negotiate closing costs, great, and I'm going to use a percentage of those closing costs to go towards my commission obligation. Great. So in that case, I have written a special stip that you would add to the purchase and sale agreement, and it says buyer shall use an amount equal to blank percent of the purchase price or blank dollar amount of seller's contribution towards closing costs to pay buyer's broker's commission. So that way, in the purchase and sale, you've got the agreed upon negotiated closing costs. Then you've got an agreement as to how much of that agreed upon closing costs the buyer will allot that their lender is supposed to use for commission. So it shows up on the closing statement like that. Any questions? Are y'all saying I explained that so well you don't have any questions? Thank you, Mika. I'll take it. Okay.
That's true.
So here's what I'm thinking, that just while we're talking about all this, this is the next couple of months. This is the way we need to start getting used to practicing. But when the changes come out, the mid-year changes come out to our forms, so much of this is going to be already embedded in those changes. I don't know what yet. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I know that changes are coming. And so you guys will be ahead of the game because you'll understand the concepts. And when you see them in the contracts, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's just making my life easier. I have less special steps to write. I have less language to write. I understand it. It all matches what I already know. So that's kind of what I'm hoping that we end up with, because we're being really aggressive on trying to explain to you guys the logistics. This little form is getting slightly revised. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to be revised yet exactly, but I know that this is a form you're going to see used a lot. So this form was originally created for trying to secure a commitment before a showing even happened, where you had a situation where maybe you are showing a house in Athens and you're not a member of the Athens MLS, but the only your buyer found it on Zillow, and maybe you work in Gwinnett or whatever. But you're like, heck, if I could sell my buyer a house in Athens and that's really where they want to live and it's only in the Athens MLS, I'll call the agent, I'll make an appointment, whatever, or maybe it's Macon or Savannah or whatever. And up until now, if the co-op commission was being advertised in an MLS where the buyer agent was not a member of that MLS, then the co-op fee did not actually have to be paid, except by the grace and generosity of the listing broker. So this form was originally created for cases like that, where if you were not a member where the co-op fee was being advertised, that you could send this before you showed the property, so you could get on the same song sheet with the agent in Athens or Savannah and say, hey, my buyer found it on Zillow, we found it on Zillow, whatever, we want to make an appointment and we want to know, are you going to honor paying that co-op or not? Because we just need to know that from the get-go. Well, now with all these changes as a result of this lawsuit and the settlement, now no MLS is going to be allowed to offer a co-op fee. So the whole offering a co-op fee that was advertised in an MLS in Savannah or Athens or Macon, and you are or are not eligible if you're a member, blah, 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 that's out the window. When these changes go into effect, that still works today. In the next few months, that whole thing will be out the window. And what this form is going to be used for is you calling the listing agent and saying, hey, can you verify, is the seller paying a co-op commission or not? And if so, how much? This is where you can start sending this to the agent and you can start trying to get them to commit in writing as to what that co-op fee is. This is going to become a form that is used a lot. And before anybody asked me, and I went over this with the GAR attorneys last week, can you upload this as a listing agent with the co-op fee already in it and upload it as a doc in the MLS? No. Can you upload the instructions to closing attorney with the co-op fee already in it? No. Can you add it to the seller's disclosure statement? No. And upload that doc. The bottom line is no, you cannot use showing time, which is a feature of the MLS, and it goes along with the MLS and setting appointments. It's part of that whole thing. You cannot enter it in there. You cannot put it in private remarks. You cannot put it on a document and upload that document, because that's all violations of the settlement. So this is going to be a document that if you're a listing agent, you're going to start seeing agents send this to you early on, usually before the house is even shown. And this is something that you're going to have to respond to quickly. And it's something that if you're a buyer agent, you're going to be using this. This comes way before the instructions to closing attorney. This is actually just saying, you're just acknowledging that financed in and agreed to in your listing agreement, which I can't see, your seller has consented to allow a block or a section or an amount of the gross commission to be used to pay the buyer brokerage commission. And we're just agreeing that that's the case in this document. We're not even under contract yet. We're not ready for an instructions to closing attorney. We're just going to get an understanding that I can go back to my buyer and say, either buyer, you're paying this out of pocket yourself and you got to come up with extra cash to close, or we have it affirmed here that the seller has already agreed that the gross commission he's negotiated with his broker is going to be shared if a buyer brokerage brings a buyer. Any questions?
Angie, I have a question.
Okay.
So I'm like being very skeptical right now. So say you call the listing agent and they say the co-op is 3%, and then you fill out this form, you send it to them, and it's lower than 3%.
Okay.
Is there
and
any?
that's why Is this Megan talking?
Yes.
Hey, Megan. Okay, so that's why you are going to start seeing special stip 620, for example, when somebody says that and you're not sure whether or not they're putting their money where their mouth is. And if they send that to you, if you sign it, you're going to put the right amount in there, the 3%. If they counter that, then it's a counter and it's not an agreement. But if they send it to you and it says something different, then you don't have to sign it. But that's where you go to your plan B. And if they said, we're agreeing to pay blah, 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 fine. There's no harm in you sticking special stip number 620 in there and holding their feet to the fire.
Okay. Thank you.
We've got lots of different, what I want you to say is there's more than one way to skin a cat here. We got lots of different plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. We've got all kinds of ways of handling this now. One thing for sure, though, is the one common denominator is it's going to be super transparent to the public. And another advantage that I see is instead of being all loosey-goosey, like, let me go out and show you houses and build a bond with you. This is what I did in the 90s and early 2000s is, let me go out and work my tail off for a couple weekends and see if you like me before I get you to commit to being my client. Everybody who's not a client, who has not signed a client agreement, is automatically a customer by default. But now more than ever, we need to get them to agree because of this lawsuit that brokers don't work for free and their licensees don't work for free. And before we go do that work of driving you around all weekend and showing you properties, we have to have an agreement of how our brokerage is going to get paid. And so that's going to help you guys close the deal and get those buyers to commit before you go do the work. And now more than ever, that's going to be really, really important. I think I see that as an advantage. And I'm working on a little memo that's what buyers need to know and what sellers need to know to understand all this, because there's so much misunderstanding. And I'm hoping to have that done, perhaps even roughed out, at least for approval by the end of the week. But that's something that our agents are wanting, something short and sweet that can kind of boil down the fat and make it easy for buyers and sellers to understand what's going on. Because a lot of them there's so much misunderstanding. Some of them think, I don't even want to know. Some of them think that people won't get paid. We're not allowed to earn money anymore. I mean, the misunderstandings are crazy. So we're going to come up with a client doc for you guys to help boil it down to its simplest form.
Hi, Angie. For 620 special step, do we need to put the percentage as well?
You have to put a percentage, but then you have to say of purchase price, or
Okay.
you can put a flat dollar amount, but you have to specify if you're going to use percentage, then you have to put of purchase price.
Okay, thank
Be
you.
very clear. Hopefully the forms committee, they've already said, I asked them this about a month ago, to change that special stip and add that language, because that language is in all of our commission blanks where it says blank % of purchase price or blank dollars. And I just said, make the special stip match that. And they said they would. So it's on their list.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome, Zena. Okay, explaining commission offers to sellers. I just want to make a little comment about this. We want to make sure that we remind sellers, and this is probably some of the stuff that's going to go in my little memo. Commissions now and always have been negotiable. They've always been negotiable. And we just had some agents that weren't really good at communicating that. And that's basically kind of where we are and what spurred what happened. There's no requirement, and there never has been, that a seller offer to pay a buyer's broker commission. Okay. So that was one of the biggest problems, is we had MLS systems that had required fields that, and you had agents out there inaccurately implying that sellers needed to offer a co-op commission, and somehow they were required. And even worse than that, you had agents out there implying that if a seller didn't offer a co-op commission, that their listing would not be shown. All of that's illegal. All of that's a violation of federal fair trade laws. Then you had agents saying, oh, not only do you have to offer a co-op commission, seller, but you have to offer at least a certain amount, because if you don't offer at least a certain amount, our fellow agents are going to boycott you. Well, boycotting people's listings based on what we earn is also illegal. So they're sitting there saying to sellers something that's illegal, then they're saying, and our industry conspires to do illegal things if you do not pay us a certain amount of money. All of that is what caused these lawsuits to happen, okay? That plus the MLSs that were making a co-op commission a required field and not allowing zero to be put in the blank. They had a software that was requiring a certain dollar amount or certain whatever. And so again, this was just all compounding, and this is why all these radical changes are now going on, because they're trying to stop the bad practices. So there is also no set amount or minimum that they must offer if they do choose to pay a buyer brokerage commission, because again, all commissions are negotiable. Please never say industry standard, never say typical, never say, just get away from minimum, industry standard. What's another good word? A standard practice, whatever. And I would even avoid words like discount. If you say discount, you are implying to someone that there's a standard that's being discounted. So again, we're going to have to change a lot of our jargon. If they choose, yes, Tom, did somebody?
No, I'm sorry. This is Shelley. I was just saying policy. That's probably another word we need to eliminate too.
Yeah, I would get away from anything like that, because at the end of the day, even brokerages can set policies and everything else, but nobody ever has to agree to hire you, and they do have every right to negotiate regardless of a policy. So, and no brokers among other companies, even brokerages within the Heart of Atlanta group, we can't conspire with one another to price fix or set a minimum amount. That's price fixing, and that was one of the big things that spurred this lawsuit. So if they do choose not to offer, we need to also prepare our sellers that if they choose not to offer, to agree to have a portion of the gross commission in their listing agreement be paid out as a buyer brokerage commission to the buyer broker that procures a buyer for them, if one procures a buyer. Then we need to, I've got hiccups. We need to prepare them that they're very likely going to get offers that are going to ask for that commission to be covered. So we just need to prepare them because, that's of the special steps and changes in our forms and everything else. So you just need to prepare them that just like the potential for a buyer asking for closing costs or a certain closing date or a certain price or certain contingencies, this is going to become a term, and that if they're not offering it, don't be surprised if it gets put into the terms of their offer on their purchase and sale. You must prepare your sellers for that. Many buyers need, this is another thing we need to explain to sellers, the advantage of having this offered is that many buyers need for the commission to be basically financed into the purchase price. So there's a benefit to having the seller, quote, pay the commission so that can be accomplished. Otherwise, buyers have to come up with a lot of extra funds and cash to close. And a lot of buyers are struggling to come up with cash to close that they have to wire to the closing attorney to cover their down payment and closing costs. And prepaids and escrows and things like that. So we're trying to advise the seller that perhaps by offering to allow a portion of the gross commission to be financed in and pay to their seller's overall expenses on selling the property, and allowing the buyer to basically finance it in, that arguably is likely to open up a larger pool of buyers that are going to be eligible and available to buy the property. because having that convenience of having it financed in, when you have some cash strapped buyers. And I'll tell you, my son and his wife are closing on their first house on Wednesday. And I'm telling you, if that commission was not financed in and they had to come up with an additional 3%, in addition to the 3.5% that they have to come up with to pay their down payment, there's no way they'd be closing on a house. And there's a lot of buyers in that situation. Lastly, buyers have a legal right to hire their own agent and broker and be represented in the sale, and we cannot do anything to interfere with that. So if you have a seller that says, well, what do we need a buyer agent for? Why should I have to pay a buyer agent? And why can't the buyer just represent themselves? Why do we even have to have that? Well, in order for the buyer to get to the point of making an offer, the vast majority of buyers are getting help seeing properties, going into properties, writing those offers, things like that, which means they've hired an agent. And once they've hired an agent, they've agreed to pay that agent because the agent doesn't work for free. And we can't do anything legally or ethically to interfere with their relationship with that agent. So it's a fact that's going to be there, and you're going to need to deal with it because it's going to exist in the vast majority of times. Okay, let's just look at this doc. This is a doc that we need to be keeping in mind when we're dealing with buyers and sellers, or landlord and tenants for that matter. I want you guys to really respect, now more than ever, the importance of using your amendment to brokerage agreement or brokerage engagement. This doc has checkboxes at the top where you can specify which brokerage agreement you're amending. And this document is so important because it's such a universal, multi-purpose thing. But anytime you have a seller that wants to change a price, or you have a situation where a seller wants to change the commission they're paying, or you have a special circumstance that may only exist in this scenario that's going to affect the commission, but it's only for this one buyer. Like maybe you're going to give the seller a reduction in what you originally agreed in your listing agreement because you're selling the property to an unrepresented buyer, and instead of charging them X percentage of the purchase price, you're going to give them a reduction. But if this deal falls through, you don't want this to be a universal lowering of the gross commission. You want it to only apply for that buyer. Anything like that. Or in a case where I think Mika mentioned it earlier, where maybe the seller is paying a 3% commission, your buyer brokerage agreement says 3% commission, but then the seller, maybe it's a builder, is offering a bonus. And right now we don't have those blanks in the buyer brokerage agreement yet saying the maximum amount that the buyer would consent to allow the seller or someone else to pay you. Those haven't gone into effect yet, so Mika wouldn't have to worry about it. She could still earn the bonus, but again, we don't know what possible changes could happen in those relationships. And I want you guys to respect your buyer brokerage and seller brokerage agreements the way that you do purchase and sale agreements. When something changes in the behavior in the agreement, you need to actually ratify that with an amendment. It's really, really important. And by all means, always turn these things in as soon as possible. Okay, here's some bad language that I just want to caution you guys on. This is an unfair trade practice, and you'll see the statute at the top. A violation of unfair trade practices, also known as license law, that basically says it's Title 43, Section 40, Paragraph 25 says that you cannot induce a person, and by a person, usually you're talking about a buyer or seller because they're the ones that bind the contract, to alter, modify, or change another licensee's fee or commission for real estate brokerage services without that licensee's prior written consent. So for years, I've told agents, don't put commission in the contract for this reason, because you don't want to in any way violate this statute and try and get a larger portion of the overall gross commission, and causing, as a result of that, causing the listing broker to get less. One of the worst special stips, and this happened a lot during the recession years when we had short sales, you would have agents that would, they would advertise a 3% co-op, and then the short sale was contingent upon all the numbers being approved by the bank and the short sale lender for the seller. And the short sale lender would say, my allotment is 4%. And however y'all want to split that, that's fine. But my allotment on gross commission is 4%. So you'd have the seller sign a listing agreement saying that their commission they agreed to pay was, for example, 6%, and that they were okay with the 3%. But guess what? That seller on a short sale was basically signing a check they couldn't cash, because at the end of the day, all their lenders, their bank, all their lien holders had to take a haircut on all their payoff amounts in order for this deal to close. And that included the brokers. So in order to overcome that, we would see agents write in this first special stip here under the list of bad special stips, and it would say all parties agree that the listing commission will be split 50-50 between listing broker and buyer's broker. We would see agents write that in a purchase and sale. We'd see agents write that in an amendment. And the minute that buyer and seller signed it, splitting 50-50, well, first of all, what is 50-50 of what? Okay, because I don't see your listing agreement, and your listing agreement said 6%. But guess what? Regardless of what your listing agreement said, nothing can close on a short sale if the lender doesn't approve of the money and the allotments. And you can't do anything contrary to what they've approved. It's their way or the highway. Everybody goes along with what they want, or they throw the hammer down and foreclose. So what was happening is, if buyer and seller signed that, then what it would do would be inflict upon the buyer broker, for example, a reduction in how much they were going to get. So now they're getting 50-50, but the 50-50 is of 4%, not 50-50 of 6%. So that's illegal. That's why special stip number 619 and 620 that we went over earlier are written by the forms committee deliberately, so that they are buyer asking seller to cover this fee for them, and also at the same time having disclosure saying nothing herein shall be interpreted as us trying to affect, alter, or change the amount of money your listing agent gets, just because we're asking for this money to be paid on the buyer's behalf. Another one was listing broker agrees to share blank % of commission with buyer's broker, 50% whatever. Again, bad special stip. And lastly, this one is not horrible, but it's not detailed and thorough enough. But we see agents writing their own special stips, and I'm begging you not to do that. I'm begging you to go do a search of the 2024 GAR special stipulations and find the list and the collection of special stips. And every year that changes. So next year it'll be the 2025 GAR special stipulations. But this is just kind of not as detailed as it needs to be. It just says seller agrees to pay buyer's broker a commission of blank % of purchase price or blank dollars. It's not adequate. It's not bad. It may not do any harm, but it's really not adequate. And it certainly doesn't have that disclaimer language in it. So that was my last slide. You guys just let me know what you think, what your questions are, what your concerns are. We've got like 10 minutes left, and then we have to hop off because there's a Contracts 101 class starting. Yes, Mika?
So my question that I put there is, it's legitimate. What is the origin of 3% as a quote unquote standard? How did that even get
It's not a
started?
standard. It's not a standard. It's just something that has over the years, that all changes. And there is no 3% standard, but that's part of the reason where these lawsuits happened, was because agents were out there telling sellers that was an industry standard, and they were telling sellers that was the amount. And price fixing is big time illegal. And when they were doing sting operations, they, meaning the Department of Justice, and doing sting operations across with Berkshire Hathaway, Remax, Keller Williams, Ansley, all these different, companies, they were finding that these, the range, it was a range, was somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. And yet you're all with licensed with different brokerages. So why is it that same dollar amount coming out? And I'll tell you, because it seems like a standard to us when we start seeing it, and this is part of the reason it's not going to be listed in the MLS anymore. When you start seeing in the MLS what other people are doing, it seems normal to you. So it's just kind of like if you want to go and you want to go to this gas station or this gas station, and they're all competitively priced within a penny or two of each other. Okay. So when I first got into real estate, it was not at all uncommon for gross commissions to be in the 7% range and co-op commissions to be in the 3.5% range. But again, markets change, things change, everything changes. And there is no standard, but a lot of it is the visual impact of people seeing that across the board offered in co-ops, and also feeling pressured to meet what other people are offering to stay competitive. And I feel like that's one of the main reasons why it's going to be eliminated from the MLS, because it's out there. It's like causing a competitive a thing where everybody feels like it is a standard when in fact it can't be.
And I asked that question because I've had a consumer ask, well, where the 3% comes from, if that's not, because we see it everywhere. So that's where I'm asking that question.
And the problem is that agents seeing that so much, our agents are really big on breaking what I call rule number one. And rule number one is don't take advice from other agents. And this behavior of using the same jargon in your listing presentations and offering the same type of commission compensation that other agents offered in the MLS, you see they're doing it, so I need to do it too. And using language like, oh, if you don't, you've got to offer compensation, seller, and you've got to offer at least this much. The agents that said that did not understand they were breaking federal law. They had not been trained properly, and they didn't understand they were breaking federal law. And they thought, I'm just doing what everybody else does, and since everybody else is doing it, it must be okay. So that's where it's gotten out of hand, and that's where the feds came in. And the reason they went after the National Association of Realtors was simply because it was the common denominator. If you looked at all these big companies that they were doing all these sting operations, the one largest common thread that all of them had in common was a membership to the National Association of Realtors. So that's why the National Association of Realtors got targeted by the Department of Justice.
Thank you, Angie. Mika, you done? Can I ask a question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mika.
So, Angie, what is the best answer to explain my commission is 6%?
You mean for a listing?
At listing appointment, and when they try to make it like 4 or 5, I explain my
Again,
value.
I'm not the person to help you negotiate and show your value. That's going to come from you, and that's something that I'm trying to help you with the legalities, but that's going to come from you and your listing presentation, because there is no standard commission. You're going to have to show the value of what it is you offer and the services you provide. So that's going to be unique to each one of you guys when you do a listing appointment. There is no standard. There's no requirement that they pay you 6%. There's also, hear me now, guys, there's no such thing as 50-50. There's no such thing that says that a gross commission is to be shared 50-50 and that the buyer agent and listing agent make the same amount. Sometimes the listing agent makes less. Sometimes the buyer agent makes less if both commissions are being covered. So there's no such thing as 50-50. There's no such thing as a standard amount. But that is absolutely something that you all have to work on, not only for your sellers presentations, but also for your buyer presentations, is you've got to work on what is it I'm going to do for this? What are the things I'm doing? How am I going to market it? What am I going to do to get the information out there? How am I going to help the seller maneuver through and negotiate. A lot of agents show their sales statistics. They show their days on the market statistics with their listings. We have a lot of different meetings and things where we have a lot of our top agents share some of their most valuable tips, and those types of meetings are going to continue. But that's something where you've actually got to figure out what is it that I'm doing, because that's what your seller wants to know when they're sitting there and you're having an appointment with them. They want to know, what specifically are you going to do for me? Boom, 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 all the things, and just kind of a bullet point. This is what I'm going to do. And they also are listening to see, are you experienced? Are you competent? Do you really know your business? Do you really understand all this? At least I would be looking for that. And then they want to know, how much is it going to cost me? So, but the days of saying this is market value, this is an industry standard, this is, la, 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 no. That type of behavior is what caused these lawsuits to occur and cause the now changes we're all dealing with in this industry, because agents were hearing other agents using bad jargon like that, and they thought it was right. And frankly, unfortunately, people do what works. And if it worked and it motivated the sellers to sign the listing agreements, then everybody was like, hey, it works, let's keep doing it. And they didn't realize what they were doing was wrong. I truly believe that 99.9% of them did not realize what they were doing and saying was wrong. It worked, and other people were doing it, and that's what they heard out on the street. And so that's what they were saying. But as we see now, it was wrong, and we've got to change our scripts.
May I ask you a question real quick?
Yes.
Okay, if I'm listing a property, going forward, I'm quoting a price to the seller based upon other properties, comparables. I'm only considering the listing side of the compensation in the list price, perhaps. In the purchase and sales agreement, or it has the co-op commission form and the instructions to close an attorney already resolved, who gets paid what if we fill out those forms?
Okay. I'm not 100% sure what you mean.
Okay,
So,
we've got a purchase and sales agreement.
okay.
Let's say, for instance, the listing agent, the seller brings the buyer to the listing agent.
Right.
Question number one, are we allowed to work in that situation, or do we have to farm it out to another agent to represent the buyer?
No, the buyer can be an unrepresented customer, and you can sell your own listing to an unrepresented customer all day long.
Okay, so do we put the listing broker's commission on the instruction to close an attorney, and then give them if there's no co-op for the buyer, then there's just one form.
It would just be, in that case, it would be a gross commission. And you may amend your listing agreement, and you may decide, I'm going to give a reduction. You do an amendment to the brokerage agreement and do a reduction to the seller, but you don't have to, because if you sell your own listing, the language in the contract says that you get the full gross commission if there is no broker to share the commission with. But you would put the gross commission in the instructions to closing attorney, and then and it says seller agrees to pay the gross commission of blank % of the purchase price to the listing broker. And then it says, or share the money with the buyer broker. And you would just put NA. Well, guys, I hate to cut out, but there is another Zoom. They're using the same account. I have got to end because we are starting another presentation like right now at 1 o'clock. So I have to let Tom start the Contracts 101. You guys email me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.